This case was suggested by Becky, who is in the chat. Becky from our Discord server. Today's case is... Whoop, whoop. The unsolved murder of Jill Dando. This is a case that took place in England. Jill Dando, you see, was a successful news anchor on the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation. I assume most of you are familiar with the BBC, and she hosted the 6 o'clock news. She also hosted the breakfast news and hosted other shows, including Crime Watch and Holiday. Of course, Crime Watch being a particular interest because Jill Dando was an anchor for a crime show. I guess the equivalent of that would be if I were murdered in an unsolved homicide. Let's not think about that. On April 26th, 1999, in Fulham, West London, Jill Dando is killed on the doorstep of her home. She is shot in close range in the back of the head with a 9mm pistol. She dies at the age of 37. The brother Nigel, he learns about his sister's death not through like the police informing him, not through, any sort of, official channel, but through the news, which is horrible. DZX says maybe someone was jealous and she's a well-known news anchor who's most likely somewhat wealthy. Either someone robbed or it was personal. Hey, that's a great, that would be my initial theory too, right off the bat, right? However, we're about to learn some other stuff that makes it a little more intriguing, actually. There is a suspect very early on. His name is Barry George. He lived on his own just a few minutes away from Jill's, and he was actually arrested. He was put away for 8 years for this crime until he was acquitted. And the case to this day, ladies and gentlemen, it remains unsolved. In 2015, there was an investigative reporter. His name is Mark Williams Thomas. He found that Scotland Yard being the law enforcement agency that investigated this case, they had actually disregarded any other leads they had just to focus in on getting Barry George, who was ultimately found not guilty in 2008 during a retrial. The gun was pressed against the back of Dando's head, possibly done so to prevent blood splatter. This is why investigators, they suspected that her death was, and I quote, a hard contact execution. Because of this execution style killing, people believed it was a hitman that had been hired to kill Jill Dando. The gun, again, was pressed against the back of her head specifically to avoid blood splatter. This wasn't just someone just in a heat of the crime shooting from afar. This person came up to her from behind and shot her in the back of her head. Let me break down for you, though, the alleged timeline of the murder. 10:03 a.m. A postman, the mailman, arrives at Jill's home, 29 Gowan Avenue in Fulham, London. Jill's house was empty, and the postman reportedly noticed being watched by a dark-haired man in a suit. 10:05 a.m. 2 minutes later, Jill is in Chiswick at her fiance's home and heads out to shop in Hammersmith. At the same time, a traffic warden at Gowan and Munster spots a blue Range Rover illegally parked, but the driver, he protests enough that they erase the information they had noted, information that could have proved very important in this case. At 10:10 a.m., there's a driver, vroom, 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 on Gowan Avenue who also notices a dark-haired man in a suit and is followed by a blue Range Rover till it stops near Craven Cottage Stadium. So that is now a separate account where there is a dark-haired man in a suit and a blue Range Rover. A lot of people, exactly, you don't want too many people still after her. Very strange, isn't it? At 10:23 a.m., Jill is caught on CCTV getting gas for her BMW. 17 minutes later at 10:40 a.m., at 26 Gowan Avenue, a window cleaner notices a man standing outside of Jill's home talking on a mobile phone. 10:55 a.m., Jill stops at an electric shop, The Link. At 11 a.m., that blue Range Rover is spotted once again, parked near the Gowan and Munster area. Another driver spots a dark-haired man in a suit talking on his phone. 11:30 a.m., Jill arrives at her home. She parks her car and heads to her front door, and that is where Jill is shot in the back of the head with a 9mm gun, execution style. 2 witnesses, they report seeing that dark-haired man in a waxed suit run away from the scene of the murder. Greg Tyler says, oh, what if her husband caused it? Well, she did have a fiance. Banana Savvy says, these guys are getting seen by everyone. Maybe it's not organized crime, at least not efficient organized crime. That's very true. Well, there's two ways of looking at that, right? Either A, these are just very, this is organized crime that didn't really think it through very much because you're right, they were getting spotted by everyone. Or B, this was organized crime at such a high level that they didn't care. At 11:32 a.m., CCTV footage, they catch a blue Range Rover chasing down Fulham Palace Road. That same blue Range Rover that was spotted earlier and whose information would have been kept if the traffic warden hadn't thrown it out when they confronted him and he caused enough of a ruckus for them to throw it away. Lyrical Whip says, could one of the BBC higher-ups be involved? Well, that would certainly be a very unnecessary way to fire someone. At 11:52 a.m., a driver has to hit his brakes. I'm terrible at sound effects. I don't know if that's a noise that brakes make. It was like, a driver hits his brake because there's a man rushing across Fulham Palace Road from the direction of Gowan Avenue, which is, where Jill's home was. Now, at 1:03 p.m., Jill is announced dead at Charing Cross Hospital. It was 14 minutes after she was shot that Jill's body was found by a neighbor. There is CCTV footage of Dando walking around. There is CCTV footage of the car, but for some reason, I guess maybe they were hiding their plates, or their plates were, false, their license plates that were, because there's not enough on it. Who knows? There is also a theory that Jill Dando could have been murdered by an obsessed fan. But, her reputation, her popularity, it's certainly not a wild theory. Just to give you a little bit more of a description of the man in the suit that was seen staking out her home. I quote here, a smartly dressed man carrying a mobile phone who might have donned heavy black frame spectacles in an attempt to disguise himself. They believe this is the person that staked out his home. The investigation, obviously, into this case begins and continues. Investigators spoke to over 2,500 people and took over 1,000 statements. That is a lot of people to investigate, but you can imagine that, again, with someone of her stature, right, a prominent BBC News anchor, people wanted answers. This was big news, and one could obviously only hope that all murder investigations are given the same attention as, someone who's on TV, but obviously that's not the case, and that's when Barry George is focused in on. Barry George is someone, again, who lived near Jill's home, and he had a history of stalking women. He was initially arrested for the murder in 2001 and sentenced to life in jail. However, throughout this entire time, Barry George kept saying, I'm innocent, and in 2007, his legal team was able to discredit the forensic evidence that was used to put him behind bars, and he was acquitted and declared innocent in 2008. One of the issues with this case is that an investigator in 2015 who looked into this case believes that the police, Scotland Yard, they focused all their attention on Barry George and disregarded other leads. And so, of course, now, at the time, you have all these other leads, other suspects, but Barry George is the focus, and Barry George didn't even commit the crime. Frustrating, to say the least. And, you can imagine that perhaps Scotland Yard felt like they had to close this case because it was such big news at the time. Rachel says, why did they focus so much on that dude? Well, that's my point exactly. I assume the police focused so much on Barry George because the public needed an answer, the media wanted an answer, because obviously the media saw Jill Dando, well, Jill Dando was one of them, and so the media was also probably ringing the alarm, and so there was a lot of pressure probably on Scotland Yard to pin this on someone, and that is obviously no excuse to send an innocent person to jail for 7 years. In 2013, Scotland Yard, they announced that the case has been reopened. So the case is still reopened as of 2013, but no one is assigned to the case full time. A new forensic review was conducted, but it did not illuminate any new information. Now I have to ask you guys this, in the case of Barry George, someone who went to jail for 7 years, I don't know how this normally works, but if you go to jail for a crime you didn't commit, do you get anything? Because I feel like, does the government, this is a genuine question, I don't know, like, does the government give you money or something to, make, like for saying, oops, sorry, we fucked up, or do you just like lose those years? The lead detective of the Jill Dando case, Hamish Campbell, stated in a BBC documentary in 2019 that he believes no other suspects will be brought to court. He was a part of the team that arrested Barry George. When asked if the murder will ever be solved, he would reply, "Do I think somebody will come back to court? Probably not. No." Campbell stated, "We had over 2,000 people named as potential suspects or responsible. Some actions to trace and eliminate one person might take a day. One action might take 2 weeks, but there's thousands of them, and that's the issue of managing stranger homicides." So let's now look over into the theories as to why she was killed. They're just theories, so we can't take these entirely to heart too seriously. So the first popular theory involves a VIP pedophile ring. In 2014, a former colleague came forward and said that in the time leading up to Jill's death, that she had been working on an expose against a VIP pedophile ring. The same colleague said that Jill brought up her concerns to higher ups regarding sexual abuse allegations at the BBC. Who was it in the chat earlier that said that maybe it was a BBC higher up? That ties into your suggestion that could be BBC higher ups. The former colleague who spoke up would go on to say, "I don't recall the names of all the stars now, and don't want to implicate anyone, but Jill said they were surprisingly big names. I think she was quite shocked when she told about the images of children and that information on how to join this horrible pedophile ring was freely available. Jill said others had complained to her about sexual matters and that some female workmates also claimed they had been groped or assaulted." This theory speaks on several levels. It speaks on the level that Jill was working on an expose against a VIP pedophile ring, but that she was also speaking out against alleged sexual abuse within the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation structure. That is, again, one of the theories as to who could have hired a hitman to kill Jill Dando. The next theory is the Serbian Mafia. Allegedly, detectives had been told that men had met at a London nightclub to plan the hit against Jill Dando as a revenge plot for the NATO-led bombing of a Serbian television station. You see, Jill had actually made an appeal on TV for Kosovan Albanian refugees weeks prior to her death. So Jill goes on TV and she makes a plea weeks prior to her death, and people believe that made her a target. There was reportedly a message sent to detectives which claimed Dando was murdered by a Serb hitman in revenge for the attack that NATO mounted. The people who planned Dando's murder meet and drink in a club called Scandal in London's West End, also the home of the theatre. One of those involved is a tall male with a swallow tattoo on his neck. 15 days before Jill's death, journalist Slavko Kuruvica, who openly criticized the Serbian regime, was also shot in the head outside of his home. So that's another wrinkle, and it's another reason why people believe that the Serbian Mafia may be behind this, because Jill wasn't the only reporter who spoke out against the Serbian regime. Jill had done so, as well as this journalist in Serbia who was also shot in the head outside his home. So perhaps Jill Dando met a similar fate to this other reporter. BBC Watchdog hosts Anne Robinson and Alice Beer also received death threats just 3 days after Jill's murder. Alice Beer, another one of these hosts from the BBC Watchdog, also revealed that Jill had received rape and kidnap threats. Nita says this is too detailed for being a theory like even the name of the club. It's definitely a detailed theory, a lot more detailed than the VIP pedophile ring theory. The next theory involves the IRA. Reportedly, Barry George's legal team, they came across a letter from prison written by a killer who claimed to be part of an IRA hit squad, kill squad, that was involved in Jill's death. The letter apparently claimed that she was killed because of her power as a host of Crime Watch, again, the BBC show she was an anchor for. And the killer said that after she was shot, the team took cover in a safe house in London, escaping in a Land Rover. Don't forget, a blue Land Rover was indeed spotted numerous times by witnesses in the area. The letter, written by the supposed killer in prison, said that the purpose of the confession was to keep Barry from taking the blame. The IRA allegedly wanted Jill gone so she couldn't get in the way of the Northern Ireland peace process. Obviously, I'm not the most tapped into Northern Irish English relations, but clearly, obviously, they felt that she was getting in the way of peaceful resolution. I don't know how she was doing so, but that was part of the reason why she was supposedly killed by the IRA. And then the last theory, the last potential theory as to who could have hired a hitman to kill Jill Dando was some amorphous London crime family. An intelligence report they apparently stated that Jill could have been targeted for investigating the crimes of this London crime family on one of her shows. However, investigators at the time when they were given this lead went nowhere because the police were busy investigating Mr. Barry George, who we know ultimately was not involved with this case. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where we leave it. I turn it over, as always, to all of you. Which theories stick out to you? I love to hear your theories. What do you guys think happened to Jill Dando? Was she actually killed by a hitman? And if so, who hired that hitman? The IRA? The Serbian Mafia? This VIP pedophile ring? BBC higher-ups? This London crime family? Or was it someone who wasn't even mentioned at all here today? Where is your mind taking you? Unfortunately, at the end of the day, Jill Dando's murder on April 26, 1999 still remains unsolved. And like with a lot of these unsolved cases, hopefully justice will be found someday. Either way, I'm so glad, as always, to have you here live in the chat, in the videos, to hold hands with Pop Pop as we dive deep into the dark underbelly of the world. And I'm excited for more. Yay.